This video presentation is brought to you by Red Hat OpenShift, the Kubernetes platform for big ideas.
All right, hello everybody. This is Dr. Shallon Brown. I am going to present to you this talk on when open source goes very wrong, cautionary tales in web development. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you for attending and taking the time to do this, particularly on a Saturday and given the circumstances. I do hope that everybody is staying safe and healthy. As the previous speaker said, I wish we could meet in person, but obviously, that will have to wait till next year. But once again, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So before diving in, just an overview, a background on myself. I do have my doctorate in information systems engineering. I received it about 3 years ago now. My alma mater was actually University of Maryland, Baltimore County for my undergraduate, which was computer science. Master's degree was from University of Maryland Global Campus, which is College Park's online division. That was management information systems. I would be, at the time when I graduated, I was the first African-American woman to ever write any published manuscript on open source. And it was the first manuscript in the world at the time to specifically ever be written on Drupal or targeting Drupal specifically. I graduated top of my class, 4.0 GPA. I've done software development for about 20 years now, and I currently am Chief Technology Officer for North Studio, which is a full-service web shop that is based in British Columbia, but we are a decentralized team that is actually all over. So that is my background. I, as noted, specialize mostly in Drupal and WordPress, also full stack as well. We do a variety of open source as well. So, the topic of this talk and getting into the meat of it is really to understand, what is it that we are looking for when we talk about outcomes for open source web projects, right? And so to do that, we first want to define what we're talking about. So this is really just to set the bounds and control mechanisms around, what specifically for this conversation we mean. So the first thing, of course, is the open source model, which by definition means that the code is freely available. It can be modified beyond the original intention. There is no licensing fee or cost associated with it. There can, of course, still be a cost associated with the developers and the team to build it. And it's often maintained by a larger software engineering community. Now, obviously, there is some wiggle room with all of these definitions. There are plenty of examples out there where one or more of these may not be entirely true. But for the bounds of this, that's what we are mostly saying when we're saying open source models versus proprietary models. So let's talk about what our desired outcome is, right? When we talk about cautionary tales in development, we're obviously talking about things that we don't want as desired outcomes. And so a big part of this session is to really talk about, based on my years of experience in the education and just having been in the field for a long time, understanding what to look out for when things start to go haywire and what that means in order to get to a certain outcome, right? So our desired outcomes can be things like better return on investment in our digital presence as an organization. It can be a competitive edge. That's a common thing we see with a lot of our clients we want a website or a web application or some type of digital online presence that is going to make us stand out from our competition, not just, be flashy, but also give some type of competitive functional advantage. Continuously expansive. Obviously, if we're talking open source, a big part of the notion here is that, it's not canned software, so to speak. It's not pre-made and therefore defined by some singular organization that is in charge of deciding what functionality makes what build and vice versa. So, that being said, that's also a part of the equation, is that it needs to be continuously built on. Alignment with your digital strategy. So we want to be able to have a web application that is going to be able to align itself with whatever it is that we want for our organization in the long term, right? So, and when we talk about digital strategy, we are not just talking about a website. It can be whichever way your constituents interact with your organization in a digital manner, right? It can be a cell phone, it can be an iPad, it can of course be a laptop, or something to that nature. It could be a Kindle, it could be any type of digital interaction that collects information or interacts with your end user regarding your brand or organization or product. Financial benefits. So this one is, possible, a potential desired outcome, but a lot of times that's more of a long-term goal, because obviously a lot of these web projects are quite expensive endeavors and very well may exceed the original budgets that you had to work with, or the initial web presence that you had. So typically organizations are looking at financial benefits in the sense of either ditching a very expensive proprietary license, or in a way that they're trying to get their web presence to a point where they can churn up business higher to a degree that sales are up, purchases are up, perhaps search engine optimization results are better, you're getting more clicks, more returns in customers and active revenue and things like that. Increased interaction with your desired constituency. So in other words, gone are the days are where we just put a website up and thought of it in terms of, okay, it's just a site, everybody interacts with it the same way. You go here, you click there, you do that. Now, it's common for, especially in in bigger web presences, to think of a constituent or a user as a moving target that is interacting with your brand in ways that are unique to them. And it's understanding and targeting specifically what they want out of your organization and giving it to them online in digital format and as quickly as possible, and in a way that targets them without having for them to necessarily go through a bunch of other things that don't relate to them. Easier and cheaper maintenance cycles. So the idea of perhaps, there are times when there are maintenance cycles and things like that that are really cumbersome, particularly in institutions or organizations where you have a lot of complexity. It's changing a lot of hands. It's going through a lot of servers. It may be legacy. It may be like code that was written long ago before the days of frameworks. There's all kinds of reasons why some maintenance cycles can really balloon over time. Sometimes it's just sheer volume of data and functionality, but that's also common. And finally, free from expensive proprietary licenses, as mentioned. Sort of understanding, particularly for nonprofits and organizations where you have a canned fixed budget, the concept that shaving off a significant amount of money each year and putting it towards either other parts of the organizations, or putting it still into your web presence, but in a way that gets you better return on investment is also a commonality, or allows you to expand beyond what canned software can do easily. So that's the desire. We just talked about what the desired outcomes are, but let's talk about a bit the reality of what we're seeing on open market, because there is sort of a disconnect going on between a lot of what we want and what we end up with. So the reality of the outcomes is that 46% of all open source projects fail within the first year. And then another 31% total will fail or canceled completely before they even make it to launch, right? So almost 50-50 chance of actually making this huge project that we're dumping all of this time and money on actually successful and actually something that is what we even close to what we desired it to be. And companies are indeed estimated to invest between $50 to $150 billion per year on failed web projects. And tech does have the highest turnover rate. When I was doing some research leading up to this, I was surprised to look at some academic journals and find out that that is actually the case, that tech actually has the highest turnover rate of any business sector, even higher than retail, even higher than the restaurant and food industry. And that's a big deal, because if you have a roughly 1 in 6, 1 in 7 chance of not being in the same job year over year. That's high. And in our industry, where supply and demand is an issue when it comes to specialized engineers, developers, keeping people tenure at your organization as far as the ongoing institutional knowledge does add up. And losing your key developer mid-implementation cycle, as any of my project manager friends can tell you, can lead to a lot of late nights with many bottles of wine. So it is worth noting. Large IT companies also, such as Google, average tenure for engineers is only 1.1 years. And again, that's big. That's a huge number, and it applies to all what we call large tech, which is Google, Yahoo, any of those big companies that tenure rate applies. And the biggest reason for web project failure is changing or poorly documented requirements. Time and time again, it is the number one reason why things tend to go haywire is, as one of my old project managers used to say, it's very hard to kick successful field goals when the goalpost is on wheels. And so that is also something that can get to be very taxing and is a big part of where we get to when projects go wrong. So let's start to explore some of the major factors in what makes up a project, so that we can then pull this apart and better understand specifically how those factors all play together in a role of potential success or failure. So there's the people. There's three primary elements. There's the people, there's the technology, and then there's what we call the cursory constraints. So the people are just that. You have the people that are on the client side, so the client stakeholders. You have the people that are on the vendor side and the vendor stakeholders. You have your engineers, the developers, and then you have all the other support team around them, right? So that's all of the other, like project managers, discovery team, testing team, all of those elements count as the supporting team. And then you have as noting the technology that includes both hardware and software, understanding that, yes, in our world, it's far more common now for us to see things in the cloud, but as many of you know, that's not always the case. There are still plenty of places where there's still a reliance on a hard, firm software server models, as far as like in the room or in the building or native to that organization, or at least just in a standalone box. That's still a thing. And of course, the software that you're using is another big part of this. And then the cursory constraints: how much money and resources do we have, and what's the timeline? How much time are we working with? So those are all the major factors. There are, of course, many other factors that will be added in that can be unique to any project and that are going to vary, but these are the key commonalities. So I want to talk a bit. There are three examples that I'm going to go over, and each of them is a different business sector, and each of them is also a different open source tool or series of tools or stack, or however you want to refer to it. And with each of these, I want to go into some detail about what happened, and I'm using what's called the STAR method to go about this. That is talking about the situation, talking about the task that was at hand, talking about the action that was taken to mitigate it, and then talking about the results. So STAR method meaning walking through each of these and explaining the indices of the situation. So the first project I have to go over is a government contract. Now, I'm of course obscuring the name of the individual contract, and as far as the vendor that was actually doing the contracting, as well as the government agency, for the sake of non-disclosure. But it was an extremely large government entity. It was one of the largest government entities that we have. It was indeed an 8-figure contract, so we're talking tens of millions of dollars. It was an actual, really 8-part project, so working on one of those 8 parts, so the actual bigger context of the contract was much larger than that, but this particular sector was 8 figures. It was an internal-based Drupal platform, so in other words, not public-facing. This was for internal use. there was a desire to communicate internally about business processes. So typical intranet type stuff, being able to store documents, being able to have comments uploaded and save them and comment off of them and all of that good stuff, being able to track initiatives or anything that was communicated online in a similar manner to a social media as far as an effect. Obviously not as robust as something like Facebook or something like this, but still that's the idea behind it, is sort of a social network for internal staff. This was replacing an old Oracle portal. I think they were still on like 9i or something very ancient, in an effort to cut out all the expensive licensing costs, and also for them to be able to effectively implement things on the fly without having to wait for functionality enhancements from any canned system. So that was really the situation. Now, the task at hand was to implement this. By the time I was on this project, it had already been well underway. And this was something that had already been in implementation for a good 6 to 9 months by that point in time. However, the contracting vendor had never done Drupal before. This was about 8 to 9 years ago. They were new to Drupal. They were not new to PHP, but they were new to content management systems in general, like WordPress and Drupal, and understanding that there is a lot of nuances with that are different from just framework PHP. So they really started doing this using Java engineers that were specialized in Java and had some PHP experience. So I think you guys know where this is going. And there was no architectural plan. The notion was that they could sort of just, for every problem that would arise or every piece of functionality, let's just install a module and try our best to get it to work type of mentality, which of course becomes problematic over time if you are using redundant functionality that exists in multiple modules. It's hard to know where certain functionality is coming from when you're seeing it interact online, as well as just the notion of maintaining it, because it starts to balloon and balloon. So again, no plan, no blueprint for the house, none of that. So the action that we were, again, trying to achieve was to implement the system and get it up and running. But by the time, it was at that stage, there were over 550 modules installed. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. That's how big the build had gotten. And it exploded. It was incredibly slow. Timeouts were the norm. It was rare for the homepage to actually load successfully on the first time. Usually you had to try to load it a couple times. And issues with access. And so what that led to with the frustrations of a system that your client doesn't like is, of course, they get frustrated with the entire situation. And then they say, well, let's drastically change the requirements to adjust to the fact that we're dissatisfied with this model. And that's an issue, right? Because when things are going haywire, you really want to pump the brakes as just a matter of basic science, right? It's just innate that if things are starting to really go off the rails, we want to take a moment to knock things back a gear and really assess it and then recalibrate and adjust. But the opposite happened, where we're completely changing requirements around the fact that the product isn't what we want. And the engineers, myself, along the way, we were all saying that, this needs to be completely rebuilt from scratch. We need to start with a fresh build of Drupal core and work our way back up. And it shouldn't take as long as the first time, right? Because there's some pieces of this can be salvaged, certain elements of custom code and things like that. But in general, this is not going to be a sturdy car when you guys get it. No matter what we do, we can keep slapping a lot more money in it, but it's just not going to work out. There was extreme burnout and turnover on this project. And when I say extreme, we started off with a very large team. As noted, this was a larger contract. There were 13 developers. There was a primary project manager and a secondary or VP project manager, just given the size. And then there was also 2 requirements gatherers as well, and a director that was overseeing all of it. And by the time after 4 months had gone by, there were only, of those 20 people, there were only 2 of us left on that project. Everybody had either defected to other parts of that bigger contract or left the company. There were working every single weekend weekend and on Saturdays and working late nights every night. And it was just extreme. And mostly because of the sales-driven client relationship. So when I say sales-driven client relationship, what I'm specifically saying is that think of it sort of like in a modern web hemisphere and a large company, you have two major elements, or really three major elements. You have chief financial officer, chief technology officer, and chief executive officer. And they usually represent some of the three major elements of your company, which is your finances, so the accounting, the money, the technology, which is, of course, the engineering wing of it and the kind of heart of the engine room, and then the marketing and all that comes with the sales and things like that, and that's usually CEO. So those are the three wings, and they all kind of talk to each other to steer the ship effectively in any modern organization. In this particular ship, it was being sailed heavily by the sales and marketing wing. And because of that, there is the desire, of course, as a primary element of sales to appease the customer at all costs, no matter what is being asked. And of course, without the balance of the finances along with that, as far as, but there's constraints of money. And okay, yes, there's also constraints of the technology and the staff to be able to deliver these things on time. Then, of course, those other elements start to go haywire, which is what happens. The budget will go greatly out of whack, and the technology we can't keep up with that delivery momentum, and we can't keep up with the pace of how we're expected to churn out product, and then inevitably people burn out and there's turnover. So eventual system collapse and abandonment, they did give up eventually and say that they were going with Salesforce, and we're like, we're had to migrate everything off of this failed product that we, spent 9 to 18 months of our lives really trying our best to deliver. And the other, downside to all of this that I think gets possibly missed or forgotten is that when projects like this fail, it really scares your clients off of open source. It really can scare them, or with whatever product they're failing on, frankly, but open source especially, because it's such new territory for a lot of bigger organizations, particularly in older organizations like government entities and things that have been around a long time. Just general apprehension around that, especially if they are used to the bigger things like Oracle and IBM, Microsoft proprietary systems. Some of these concepts can be a bit scary for them, and so it puts them off even more. And so that's also sort of a big downside when these things go off the rails. So that is kind of the outcome of the first project I in reference to. So again, just looking at the pattern here of what went wrong, drastic changes in requirements, things like, we started with a top-down design, meaning that, if you have top-level admin access, obviously you can see everything. Then there's a level down from that, which is supervisor, meaning you can see almost everything, and then getting smaller and smaller levels down to the fact where if you're kind of the lowest level admin, there's, very small amount you can see. But then the model got kind of flipped upside down, where they started to say, well, maybe admins should have full access so they can do more administrative things. And that completely flipped things upside down, right? Because it's a completely different way of designing your system architecture, the algorithms that mechanate it, all of that, as far as who accesses what when, from the inside out. So those were some of the big hurdles. So the next project I want to talk about is large nonprofit. I worked for one of the biggest nonprofits in North America for about 8.5 years of my life. And so, that large nonprofit, and I work for different divisions of it. So this is, not sort of all centralized. But it was, this particular implementation was a WordPress implementation that was done about 5 years ago. And it was decided that WordPress was already being used for a number of brochure level sites for this organization. And so they were very akin to how to use it, how to do content edits on it, how to be able to successfully, effectively, proctor and utilize this in a way for their campaign funding. So being able to use a site where, okay, we want to be able to get a simple WordPress site up, but we also want people to be able to do donations online for it. And doing that in such a way that we can advertise where that funding is going, and all that goes with that. There was a strong desire for ease of use and have it to be eye-catching in nature. For this particular organization, campaign funding online was still something that they were trying to get used to. They were very used to the more in-person models of campaign funding. And so there was sort of this adaptation to understanding what gets people online engaged with donations in a different way from the kind of in-person type of fundraising. So that, and for it to be eye-catching, for them to stand out. Schools are also in the business of making money, as we know, or especially, nonprofits are still in the business of making money for their organization. And so they are also, in a lot of cases, competing with other nonprofits of scale. That's the reality. So there is a desire to be able to show on a large scale what they can do, how even their technical prowess may stand out against other nonprofits, because they have to. And so WordPress also dovetail well with their existing infrastructure. They already had so many that they figured, okay, we'll just put this on the same cloud infrastructure and everything will be fine. This particular site, they had big dreams and visions for what they wanted out of the larger context of the site down the road. So they wanted single sign-on. They wanted a constituent relationship management system. They wanted dual authentication. They wanted all of these things and more over time woven in with this. And so, they did not know the limitations of WordPress. They did not know what WordPress was originally built for. So as many of you guys know, WordPress was originally built for blogging. It was not built for all that we're trying to make it do these days, although, of course, it has evolved, as has Drupal and other full stack models. But that said, it does still have its limitations. There are better tools for certain elements of web implementation, depending on what you want. So in doing this, they actually did launch the site. They actually did get it up and running fairly quickly. And then 3 months after launch, there was a major security breach. They were not as innately aware of WordPress's inherent security issues. And that led to a major breach that resulted in a large amount of data loss, as well as data security acquisition issues as far as getting end user data, issues with trying to figure out where the encryption problem went wrong, where the database issues went wrong, how somebody got in. It took a long time to mitigate that. The fallout was quite great. And in addition to that, all of the custom plugins that they were making were more costly in all likelihood than if they had just either gone with the full stack model or Drupal or something similar. The cost of mitigation and restoration in total end up being well over 3 times the original cost of the project. So understanding here that the selection of open source tool that you use is a real critical cornerstone that is going to be a major decision that will ultimately determine how successful your web project will be. Because if you are trying to cram a huge amount of stuff into a tool that wasn't built for all of that, you will struggle. And vice versa. I think that if you try to use a tool that is larger and more complex than you had bargained for, and your needs are not that complex, you will struggle. So it's finding that sweet spot. I think I consider it more like the Goldilocks in the 3 bear scenario. It's not too hard, not too soft, but just right bed. And that's going to be the best way to get the best outcome for you. And then when projects overrun in budget, that also sets off a domino effect, as many of you know. So that means that, it's going to affect other things in the pipeline. It's going to hurt your budget outcomes. It's going to prevent you from sticking to your target digital strategy. And for many organizations, that is often a linchpin that can prevent them from doing a lot of things that they had lined up for the year. Again, there was large turnover during this project as a result of all these frustrations. A lot of the engineers got a lot of the ball drop or the blame or however you want to call it for this, and the frustration with it because it was such new technology and it did go say haywire. There was a lot of turnover, and that was rare for nonprofit, especially in general. It's more rare to see that. So that was something that was really striking. Again, there was now apprehension for open source in general. There's now a feeling that, well, maybe we should just pay the money for big proprietary systems because of the notion that it will be more secure, more stable, and those types of things. So kind of an idea of a warranty or more of a guarantee is the notion. Obviously, that's not always the case, but there's sort of that feeling. Rebuild scheduled, so they've said they want to try this again during the next campaign cycle, but are not sure what the platform will be because of all of this. And then obviously the breach mitigation will go on for years, understanding that there's a long drawn out legal process that can come with these mitigations. It's not just the technology, it is the user breach of it. There can be lawsuits, there can be all types of entanglements that could go on for years and years. So it's a serious thing when those breaches happen. Okay, and finally, a large private sector organization. So this was a full stack project. It was using Laravel and of course just PHP out of the box. This was real estate sales management. So the coordination of the real estate coordinators who are showing off homes to potential buyers, them charting which homes they're showing off, what's for sale, what process in the sale, what part of the sale process it's in, and those types of things. So again, full stack, it was indeed well designed. This did have an architectural pattern. It was object oriented and followed a model view controller compliant type of layout. So all of those things were actually sound. It was a large scale system that was built to be eventually well over $500,000, so $750,000 contract, and it was huge. It was going to fundamentally be the big element that got this particular real estate firm moved from a smaller real estate company to a medium-sized one. But it was a smaller initial development team. They staffed up late, or the contract got revved up off to the races very quickly. And that resulted in only 2 engineers that knew everything about what was going on. This was a high volume transaction-based system, meaning that there was a lot of coming and going. There was a lot of people logging their interactions with clients, logging what they did that day, and it was by the tens of thousands. So this was quite, relatively speaking, larger in volume. There was a desire to do an agile methodology here, and the problem was that in doing that, there was not the allowance for agile methodology in such a way that it did proper chronology of events. So in other words, if you are going to implement a system where you want to do this in the tiered model of, full stack model view controller, understanding what has to come first, the chicken or the egg, the data model first, and then building off it towards the front end. And that's not to say that's the only way to do it. I've worked on plenty of projects where you don't have to have that underlying data model. You can just do shells and hooks and things, but it's having that plan that's the important part. You can't just move things around in a Kanban board as easily on full stack projects. I have found just because the client wants a certain functionality first without being really careful about it, and without figuring out what the ripple effect is going to be down the road. And then bringing other developers on too late in the cycle, ballooning from 2 engineers that know everything to 7 and trying to play catch up, meaning you're doing the onboarding, the local environment setup, you're doing the educating them on what the system is, how the data model works, what is coming when. It's a lot of moving parts later in the game. And that was a real struggle that led to a lot of confusion. Not everybody's on the same page at once. Everybody's skill set is slightly different, all of those things moving. So that project actually did launch, but it was over double the initial projected cost. And a lot of developers, it started with 2, went up to 7, and then got knocked back to 3 or 4. Several developers end up losing their jobs because of the overrun and because of kind of the speed of what happened. There was also client satisfaction issues along the way because of the excessive budget and the timeline that exceeded, that then bled into other projects. So people in an organization talk, as we all know. And so if they become dissatisfied on one project, they start to talk to other people in their organization that are working on other projects you may contract with, and that can cause stability issues all around. Maintenance and expansions now require extensive onboarding for new devs. This is a custom-built system, and with any kind of custom-built hands-ups from the ground-up system, yes, it's framework, so there's certain assumptions that we as engineers will be able to make, but it's not the same as something like a system where you're pulling completely from, or mostly from, the open source community, and there's a certain understanding that people come in the door with what they're getting. as developers. So let's go over the commonalities of all of these examples. Let's talk about just a summation of all of this, and what went wrong as sort of what we see across all of these different types of organizations and all of these different types of projects. So first, mixing engineers of different specializations without universal training is generally a bad idea. I am amazed at myself with how many organizations will get non-specialists in a particular variant of open source and just kind of put them into a project without understanding that, you know, that's not going to operate the same level as a seasoned senior engineer that is specialized. And that's not to say that you don't want to necessarily mix and match. I do think there's great benefit to training engineers that have specialization in other things, or other variants of IT, as long as they want to do that. But you still need several people at the helm of all of it that are seasoned to be able for this to turn out well. Otherwise, you're learning on the fly. You are building the car as you're driving it down the road. It's dangerous. This is all relatively new technology that we're layering and playing with together. And a lot of times you can get results that you did not expect. And that's just an outcome, or just a very primary fundamental element of science. And this is science. So the lack of proper architectural planning or preliminary assessment was also common in a lot of these cases. Not everywhere, but even with an architectural plan, as noted in the last example, we can see that things can go haywire if we're adjusting on the fly and not really thinking about this in real time. So it's having a plan and then properly assessing it both preliminarily and throughout the process. Lack of risk assessment. So in the beginning, be able to say, okay, what's our area of greatest risk? And in a lot of open source projects, I found that your greatest point of risk is not going to be the tried and true tools, right? Or if we're talking about Drupal, for example, Drupal core is not going to be your area of greatest risk in general. It's going to be some of these tangential modules that don't get well maintained, right? Even modules that get better maintained are lower risk inherently because the bugs have been flushed and kicked out of it. That's not to say you can't still hit them. It just means there's less of a risk or a chance to do it. So that type of detailed assessment needs to also happen so that you can plan accordingly and formulate a plan A, plan B, plan C for high risk areas. Not doing that inevitably means that you are going to just say, okay, here's the blueprint of how to start building, and you're going to hit roadblocks because there was no really looking at what goes where and the implications. No proper course correction early on. If things are going haywire, it's important to course correct while you still have budget and time. Don't wait until it's already in a panic state or a fever pitch. Overestimating the reliability of facets of an open source model. So understanding that, yes, as noted before, this is open source. This is not canned. And as a result, there are a lot of times adjustments and things that we have to make that we didn't plan for. And that's the pro and con. It's a double-edged sword of our industry, is that, yeah, the sky's the limit. I can, with a team of engineers that you pay, I can build you whatever you want, from the ground up. But of course, then that means that, again, it is brand new. It is just freshly built. It is going to be more bug prone. Again, the caveat or the overside of the other side of that is that, it is something that is less tested and less tried and true. Inadequate scope tracking that specifically tailors to open source was another big issue. Lack of budget padding for developers. For onboarding and setbacks. So making budgets that assume the best case scenario is a bad idea in general. And I understand there's constraints around sales and getting a sale, but it's also just better to admit that we underbid than trying to force a round peg into a square hole. About the scope tracking, we want to make it so that scope tracking tailors to an open source environment. It should not necessarily tailor to just generic, elements of implementation. There are different constraints around open source implementation, specifically as noted about implementing things that are full stack and moving elements around there that do not necessarily they do have to follow a pattern or a regular walkthrough of implementation. So I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of plow through this. But also requirements, sustainability issues, so updating your requirements as we go through these cycles as well. So lessons learned. Developer burnout is real, and turnover is considerably more costly to an organization due to supply and demand constraints. So understanding this as a real thing. When developers leave, it can take time to get them in. It can take months. It's not always a quick thing, and especially for the good ones, they are expensive. So keep that in mind. Try to make sure that you are keeping in tune, that your developers are getting what they need, and that they are contributing, and that their voices are heard. Encourage co-development and ask questions a lot. I've told people before, if you are apprenticing to become a great shoemaker, a great designer, a great fashionista, a great something, you usually apprentice side by side with your mentor. I am amazed how much we tend to go to disparate environments in tech, and we don't co-develop. And it's like, how do you learn to be as good as we can be if we're all in silos? So encourage those questions, encourage co-development. It's not cheating off a test to say to somebody, you are more experienced than me, how can you help me? Running over budget slightly, get creative with your clients' PMs and use it to your advantage, don't panic. You ask them to give you online reviews, ask them for Google and Yelp, try to mitigate some of those things. You'd be amazed what some people will do if you say you'll write off a few hours. Always do a lessons learned session at the end of your project. Always, always. You are not going to be the best you can be as an organization if you are not. If you aren't tracking requirements, you aren't catching all the scope increase, period. If you aren't constantly looking out for scope increases and tracking them carefully against the existing scope, you are doing yourself a disservice, and you are probably doing work for free. Adapt and change course if things are going haywire, even if it means drastic technical measures. I understand there are budget constraints, but if things are going off the rails, again, better to bite the bullet and say we underbid and need to eat something than to keep churning at something that will eventually even lose the client or more shortly. Soft launch is indeed a great concept. Please use it. It is indeed where most of us are on the web going these days, I have found. So be sure to consider that in your implementation cycles. All right, I'm going to stick around and look for just monitor the QA queue here briefly as we switch hands, but for questions and answers. But I thank you all so very much for watching my presentation. Again, I hope you all are staying healthy and staying happy during this crazy time. So. All right, and it looks like I do have one QA question, possibly. Okay, I do see some QA, but when I click on the button, I cannot see what the question is. So I'm going to.
Hey, Shallon, I can read the question for you.
Okay, sure. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any tips for having discussions about these issues with your team or even your leadership?
Sure. So I think that the best way to do this is to always come to the table with what you sense is an issue and your solution for solving it, or even a series of plans or solutions to mitigate it. So it's best when you can give people options. They tend to respond the best when it's not all bad news. If you say, well, things are not going quite as planned, but here are 3 possible ways to mitigate it. And typically I do it in such a way where it's on a scale of least to most expensive, because a lot of times that's just how the solutions end up. It's, okay, we can put this much into it, we could do it very cheap, or we could do it for free, or something on that level tends to help ballpark this range in such a way that you come to the table with it. But then it doesn't come off as complaining. It comes off like you did an analytical based analysis, and that tends to get the best results I found.
All right, another question for you here. Is there any way of getting better buy-in for open source and giving back to open source within the company?
Getting better buy-in for open source and getting back to it. Yes, it's improving return on investment will always be your best bet from an executive level. People want to see how, if we go down this road, what are the pros in terms of the dollars. And that can be beyond just the means of the technology investment. It can also be investing particularly in expanded brand recognition and those types of things, lower drop cart rates, all of those type of marketing based terms. Understanding it and analyzing it based on that will also help give you a push. Also analyzing the cost of your proprietary systems outside of just licenses. Understanding that you could be paying more for tech talent because that tech talent comes with more expensive licensing if they're proprietary based, depending on the model. All of those things, really getting in the weeds with what your long term is, and also what functionality is it that you're not getting out of your proprietary system that you want or need that with an open source solution you could get without a license. Those are also big things that can help you move the needle.
Fantastic. Another question. I run into Project 2 situation all the time where the client asks for a bunch of custom features, but insists on using WordPress. How can I convince the client and my sales team that there are other options?
Absolutely. So WordPress, the first thing I just did a review with a client of that exact same thing a few weeks ago. And in summation, the answer is that WordPress is the least secure content management system on the planet, period. It is the most hacked. It is a security nightmare for any of us that are in the business. It is quite common for us to have clients that come to the door. Their system is bleeding. They are on the verge of bankruptcy because they've been hacked so badly, the system's offline entirely. They're trying to get us to resuscitate it. That's common in our world. So that's first and foremost. If they want something to talk them off the ledge of WordPress, that's number one. Any e-commerce based system, in my opinion, and this is just me as a seasoned engineer, should not be on WordPress at this time. It is not safe enough. And all of the things that we have to put into place on a security measure on a server level to mitigate it, to help prevent it, are usually more expensive. The other part of it to think of is plugins. Custom plugins in WordPress is inherently hacking, right? It never went through a big MVC compliant overhaul like Drupal did. So it's hard to maintain once you start going down that road. And that also leads to less security. And so it's hard to get engineers in and out of it. So customizing WordPress doesn't make a lot of sense as far as under the hood, when Drupal or something similar was built to do just that. It's using the wrong tool for the wrong job.
Okay. Another challenge, of course, is burnout. Do you have any recommendations to reduce burnout?
Yes, talking to your engineers and building a rapport and understanding what they're making their voices feel like they're heard. Also, keeping them out of the fray of the client interaction is big. Your engineers, of course, are at their best when they're focusing on the solution to the technical problem, not all of the client relationship stuff. That should be for your project manager or whoever is coordinating that. So that's a big part of it. Two, there are few true emergencies in our world. Obviously, everybody wants their stuff on the web quickly. You guys know that. So it's really more saying, okay, we define an emergency as one of two things. Either a production system is down or we're right on the verge of a production launch. Those are the reasons for late nights. Anything else is not a reason to be working crazy hours in excess. Yes, we all have to put in some extra hours at work, but if that's a habit, then that is the big key for burnout. So watching and monitoring that, and also adhering to their timelines. If they're telling you something can't be done on time, you should listen and just bite the bullet and accept it versus trying to really make it fit, or bring in new staff to help them, bring in other engineers to help balance the load. But forcing them into doing that is not fair to them, and it will also lead to frustration and burnout.
Looks like one more question, and that is any other resources that we can look at or get information from?
Absolutely, yes. On our northstudio.com, we have a blog series that we are writing and have started writing that is all about some of these concepts. And so that is number one. For other good sources of ways to kind of understand this. I will say that conferences like this, I know it sounds cliche, but talking to other senior engineers is good. Kindle, Amazon books and bestsellers as well, looking at other engineers in open source that specifically talk about some of these larger scale impacts of open source. I've also learned a lot about those commonalities as well from some of those best-selling books. Joe Romm is also a great author that wrote about how to go viral. He's a great inspiration to me. He's a best-selling author, and it talks about the great shift to models that get people's attention off of old newspaper type models and how to make that work. So he is a great one to look at.